A reading from Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward and said, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. And for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I honestly dislike this parable for so many reasons, not the least of which is that it takes its frame of metaphorical reference from an imperialist economic system that is harshly criticized elsewhere in the Gospels. And generally, I love parables. The parable is one of my favorite genres in the biblical literature. It's just this parable that is so troublesome to me. But if we're honest, parables are intended to disturb us in some way. If we come away from a parable feeling comforted in what we already think we know, then we have probably missed the challenge that the parable holds for us. So let me try to work through some of the difficulties of this parable and see where it might lead us. A master summons 3 of his servants and entrusts them with sums of money while he embarks on a journey for an unspecified period of time. To one he gives 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1. Now, a talent is an extraordinarily large sum of money that is equal to the wages earned by a day laborer over the course of about 15 years. So to one slave, he left the equivalent of 75 years worth of wages, to another 30 years worth, and to another 15 years worth of cash. In total, the 3 slaves were handed 120 years worth of a day laborer's wage, more than they could have even imagined seeing in their lifetime. Parables traffic in hyperbole. And the master gives them absolutely no instruction whatsoever about what to do with this enormous sum of money. And when he returns, he is elated by the sight of piles of cash, far larger than he had left from the first 2 servants. He didn't ask them how they made their money. Ponzi scheme, payday lending, selling some poached animal parts on the black market, hire mercenaries to go rob all the neighbors. He didn't care. Well done, good and faithful slave. Well, this 3rd servant has taken quite a beating in our historical preaching on this parable. But let me tell you, just so that we are clear, there was nothing unusual or stupid about digging a hole in the ground and hiding one's money in it. In fact, it was a pretty safe way of stashing one's savings in that era, sometimes more reliable than banks, as there was no FDIC insurance or safety deposit boxes. It wasn't stupid or careless what this slave did. It just wasn't lucrative. And I have to imagine that what made his master angrier than not having another huge return on his investment was the accusatory way that this slave explained to him why he did what he did. Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Now here, have what is yours. And then he gathers all the slaves in earshot around for a little lesson at the expense of this one and says, for all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. And for all those who don't produce a profit by whatever means necessary, you are worthless. And aside from the underhanded way that his master made his money, and the fact that no one in the parable invested money and lost some of it, which is bound to happen, aside from the fact that the third slave didn't do anything wrong and spoke the truth about the master's shady business practices only to be severely punished, aside from the reinscribing of imperialist economic practices and the worthlessness of those who aren't worth anything to begin with, I think I don't like this parable most of all because it's a little too real when it comes to those who invest their lives and skills and their money in a church. When it comes to this parable, in our context, putting your money in a scrappy little peace and justice congregation like this one might just put you in the category of the third servant, burying your wealth in a hole in the ground in a world that only values high yield returns on investment. But a lot of preachers have gotten a lot of mileage out of this text when it comes to stewardship sermons, encouraging people to be like the first two servants, not like the third one that just hoards the wealth, but doing something good with it, like giving to a church. But that interpretation might backfire on us. You know, maybe we'd get more out of our money if we took a lesson from the first two slaves and we went out into the marketplace and we learned to play the game like those who know how to reap where they haven't sown and harvest what they didn't plant. Maybe we should be hiring lobbyists rather than pastors, or cozy up to politicians who can scratch our backs in return for votes. Or maybe develop our property for maximum profit potential. Or invest in big oil and the military-industrial complex, because that's where we will turn our measly talent into 5 or 10 or 20. Because, you know, engaging in things like nonviolent protests of injustice, and caring for people in their most vulnerable states of grief and infirmity, and sticking our noses into ancient texts, and creating ephemeral beauty through music and art, and standing in solidarity with the least of these who don't have a dime to their name, and striving for racial justice in our congregation, and keeping up a building where nonprofits in our community make their home, and communities gather for antiquated rituals of worship, and all that sort of stuff, seems like burying your money in a hole in the ground, while everyone else is raking in huge returns on their investment. So in this week before ingathering, as we make one final push toward inviting the congregation into a new way of relating to our resources, because how we relate to our resources is a spiritual matter, particularly when it comes to money, which has a bad habit of becoming a god. These sorts of questions become, in this time, a matter of spiritual health and commitment to following Jesus, as much as concerns of prayer or social justice practice or anything else. So I want to make a defense. I want to make a defense for putting your money in what seems like a hole in the ground to a predatory economic system that is obsessed with earning potential and making a quick profit by any means necessary. Because if this parable holds any economic lessons for us, they might be more about subverting the economic logic of the empire, or telling the truth about money, or confronting systems of predatory gain, than they are about making your money work for you. And in that case, it's no wonder that this is a difficult parable to take in. There's another parable I heard not too long ago that is strikingly similar to this one in many ways. It's from a rabbinical Jewish midrash that was compiled between the 7th and 10th centuries. So here it is. I'm going to read it to you with just a little midrashic embellishment of my own here. There was once a king who had 3 servants whom he loved more than all his other servants. One day the king gave each of them, these 3 favored servants, 2 bundles to take with them and do something with. One was a bundle of wheat and one a bundle of flax. One servant went to the market to see what he could make of these bundles. He was a shrewd businessman, and he traded and traded for weeks, and finally sold all of the goods that he ended up with. And when he brought his bundles back to the king, they were bundles of cash, worth twice as much as the original bundles of wheat and flax. And the second servant was a very vigilant person, careful. And he was able to be trusted with valuables for safekeeping. And he went and kept the wheat and flax in a very safe place, away from the animals, dry from the rain, hidden from the eyes of potential thieves. And when the king returned and asked his servant for the wheat and the flax, he brought forth the bundles and presented them to the king just as they were entrusted to him. And the last servant was a bit of a dreamer, not particularly business savvy, not especially able to hang on to valuables for very long. And the king knew that. So upon the king's request to bring forth his bundles, the servant brought out a table covered with a beautiful linen cloth that he had spent hours upon hours carefully weaving from the bundle of flax. And in the middle of the table, he placed a big, warm loaf of bread that he made by milling the wheat and grinding it steadily until it turned to flour, and sifting the flour and progressively kneading it by hand, and finally baking it into a huge, delicious loaf of bread. And when he broke that first loaf for the king to smell, it was steaming hot. And the aroma of fresh bread filled the hall and made every eye widen and every mouth water. And the king gathered everyone in earshot around the table for a feast. And everybody at the table that day went home talking about this bread for months. Each household trying to replicate the deliciousness of this bread that they had tasted at this silly servant's handmade linen-covered table. And as we approach ingathering next Sunday, to my mind, this is what it is like to give your resources to a church like OCBC.